Now, world figures, people from all walks of life have been paying tribute to former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who passed on Saturday at the age of 80. The Ghanaian national served as the UN chief from 1997 to 2006 and he was the first black African to ever hold that post. We want to talk about his legacy and obviously his impact on Kenya. And joining me in studio to have that particular discussion, let me start right here next to me. We have Professor Yash Pal Ghai, who's a constitutional lawyer and former chair of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission. Welcome to the program, Professor.
Thank you.
And also to my far right there, we have Irungu Houghton, who is the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. Karibu sana, Irungu.
Morning.
Thank you so much. Prof, let me start with you. When did you first meet Kofi Annan? And be honest with us, what were your initial thoughts about the man?
Well, he appointed me as his representative in Cambodia for the protection of human rights. And in that position, I had to make periodic reports to him on how things were improving or getting worse.
Or deteriorating.
In Cambodia. And so that was my first real contact with him. And the UN was quite divided as to how active a role I should play. And some thought I should be low-key. But I didn't think that was going to help. But Kofi Annan then supported my sort of more outspoken position. Then I ran into him, the odd meetings, the UN.
How would you describe his leadership style? Was he firm? Was he a delegator who would tell you, yeah, Professor, go ahead and do what you need to do?
I think he gave, at least as far as my own experience is concerned, he gave me some guidance. He didn't interfere too much, as the UN office in Geneva did. I had problems with them, and but then I would contact him, and he would sort of
intervene.
Yeah, intervene. So that was my first contact with him. When after the violence of 2007-8, they were formed as a team to. The UN was asked to nominate a lawyer, and I was nominated.
Okay.
But Kofi Annan very sensibly said, no, I don't want Guy. And he brought a Swedish lawyer who had been the lawyer for UN for many years.
Okay.
I think that was a very wise decision.
It took a lot of trouble from you.
Yeah, also in a way, because I had been involved in the Constitution draft, which the government had rejected. And one of his very first statements, to my great pride, was, if you had got the Guy Constitution, you would not be in this trouble. So that was a very nice thing to hear that.
I guess there would have been some concerns from some parties that you would have been partisan in the negotiations after the 2008.
Yes.
Okay. Hang on there, Prof. Let me also bring in Irungu briefly. Your first experience with Kofi Annan?
It's about a decade ago, obviously, when the first 2 months of the negotiations, and that's the first time I ran into him. I was almost like a permanent guest at the Serena Hotel. Typical lobbyist. I spent a lot of time in the corridors. In fact, I actually didn't report for work for 90 days. I was then working with Oxfam. So I spent a lot of time passing documents, giving analysis, giving counsel and advice. And that was the first time I met him. The last time I met him was 2 years ago. And in a different capacity, but very much the same man.
Did he whisper to you the frustrations he was facing as he was trying to shuttle between one side and the other?
No, I mean, the thing about Kofi Annan that I think everybody appreciates is that he was a man of grace. He was a man of generosity in terms of he listens very well, but he was also a very tactful man. So that he did not speak recklessly, he did not share his inner thoughts, because he realized as a consummate negotiator that actually you need to absent yourself in order to hear people speak and to hear those opinions. And that's what I remember of him in those months in 2008. In 2016, I was working on the African Green Revolution Forum, which was a conference, Pan-African conference organized by AGRA. And he had just stepped down as the chairperson of AGRA, but very much influential. And what I remember there about him really was his love of detail, his love of data, his love of evidence, and you know, just really a sense of grace.
Okay.
A man of grace.
A man of grace. Professor, coming back to you, what do you consider his greatest achievements?
Well, he had many achievements.
Help us narrow them down.
I would say that as a Secretary General, he did a lot to reform the UN system itself. And he wanted, I think, greater engagement of the UN in international affairs, especially with involved violence. I think he placed a lot of importance on human rights, which of course is my own area, and I was pleased to see him pushing hard for human rights. He played a role not only in Kenya in preventing conflicts and so on, but also in the Middle East. I myself was advisor both in Iran and Iraq and in Afghanistan.
Nominated by him?
No, not by him.
Okay.
In fact, by the time I was doing the last one of these in Afghanistan, he was had ceased to be Secretary General, but he was very active in the UN work.
That's correct.
And so I always found him very, very sympathetic. And I know one of his big disappointments was that he was unable to stop a fair bit of conflict in the Middle East. Even when he had ceased to be Secretary General, he kept his interest in that area, which was, as we all know, an extremely difficult area to bring peace to. And
he almost refused to retire, is how some have described it. It's like he retired and then sort of his schedule became even more hectic after.
Yeah, well, he did. And as you know, he set up a foundation in Geneva, and they played a positive role. He invited me to 2 or 3 meetings there.
Okay.
And I think it was a useful organization. It still, of course, works very actively and with particular interest in Africa, but not only. So I think that was also an important contribution that he did.
Wow.
And just because he was Kofi Annan and ex-Secretary General, he always had an audience.
Okay, when he makes a call, I know people would pick the phone. Irungu, let me come to you as well. He's been described in some sections of the press as the man who saved Kenya. Why was he able to achieve what he did in Kenya, but, and if I can sort of turn this around, and yet many accuse him of failing in Rwanda, Somalia, Bosnia at the time when he was in charge of the peacekeeping sort of section of the UN?
So I guess there are a couple of things. One is they of course happen at different points in history. So the man I can only assume was maturing. He was becoming sharper in his analysis. He was becoming clearer. And the difference I think in some ways is that of course he was in a much more powerful position during the time that we had our crisis. So he could
But then he had a voice and respect that he may not have had 10 years earlier.
One of the things that he did, he insisted that he would be the only negotiator. And I think the Americans at the time wanted to have Jendai Fraser and various others come in and have parallel systems. And like a good negotiator, he declared that I'm only going to be involved in this process if I am the negotiator. And that made clear that there was going to be no points of, or two centers of power in negotiations. The other thing I think that was kind of important in terms of the way that he operated was we tend to forget that actually a number of negotiators and a number of mediators came into the country before Kofi Annan. And he actually stood on the backs of a number of people. I remember, Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop, who came in and tried to get the two sides to speak, and was not able to do that. Jendai Fraser herself, the American trade envoy, tried to do the same, was not able to do that. So I think also the fact that he came in slightly later, and there had been a couple of attempts, and also by that time probably the country was was a real crisis.
It was a real crisis.
And 1,000 people had lost their lives, 100,000 people. We saw the violence now beginning to arrive in Nakuru and Naivasha, so it had moved, the epicenter had begun to spread. And it was no longer just two provinces, 2 or 3 provinces, it was now becoming something quite national.
Okay, and of course to everyone who's watching, remember you can just send us your thoughts even as the world continues to mourn Kofi Annan. 22422 is our SMS line. Use the hashtag Daybreak. What are your thoughts about Kofi Annan? What do you remember him for? Let us know and I'll be reading your feedback even as we continue. Prof, let me come back to you as well. Do you feel that Kofi Annan really had an experience of the sort of, and I don't want to use the word hypocrisy, but I feel it's the only word to use, of Kenya's leadership? Because he, later on now it emerges the challenges that he faced. At some point he exposed what's happening behind the scenes because he felt it's the only way we're going to have a solution. And as you were working on the constitution, I'm sure you also faced a similar challenge. What would you say are the challenges of Kenya's leadership?
Well, one can say a lot about that.
One or two points that stand out for you.
I think they're extraordinarily greedy.
Extraordinarily greedy.
They have no regard for the country. And this became very clear to me during the process of constitution making, which led to the Boma's draft. And they're very sort of self-oriented. And it was, I must say that Raila was probably the best of the lot. So it was not very satisfactory working with politicians. But fortunately, the team or the groups which contributed to the draft constitution was dominated by civil society, by people from all over the country, women. We had a very mixed group, and the politicians were in a minority. And I think because of that, we were able to get a very good draft. But once the politicians took over, then the trouble started.
Yes.
So I don't have too much time for our politicians, to be very honest.
Wow.
I mean, Wahika, let me tell you an anecdote. Just to give you a sense.
He's kept it short and sweet. Carry on.
So Wahika, this is a story I was told during the heat of the moment. So you have to imagine this. You know, there's machetes flying all over the country. Fires have been set up. People are being burnt in churches. It's a horrible moment. I think nothing that we could be proud of. And in one of the mornings, one of the technical advisors to the mediation team came to me and he said, Irungu, what kind of politicians do you have? And I'll try and avoid names just so that I'm not slammed with libel and defamation. And the negotiating team, so you had, of course, PNU on one side and you had ODM on the other side, and they're waiting for the negotiations to start that morning. And one of the politicians leans forward and says to the opposite side, one of the other politicians, and says, you know, my case is coming up tomorrow. I hope you will be able to represent me.
Wow.
And Kofi Annan apparently stiffened up, looked across, and this first politician said to Kofi Annan, unfortunately, I will not be able to come tomorrow because I have a long-standing court case which is being represented
by the man on the other side.
And I will not be able to attend. And somebody on his side said, well, you know, as the minister, perhaps I could ensure that the court date is shifted slightly to allow us to continue our negotiations.
Is this a true story?
It's a true story. True story. And the South African technical advisor came to me and said, Irungu, what kind of politicians would be continuing to do business as usual when the country is burning? And I think the thing for me is not to leave any of the political class with a sense of you know, our disappointment at that time, but it was an interesting time where actually self-interest you know, began to dominate the country. One of the things that the late Tajuddin Abdurrahim used to say, he was a Nigerian activist and a good friend of Yash and mine, he used to say, Kenya is much too important to leave to Kenyans. And that's why Kofi Annan came.
And so when last year some politician said he shouldn't come back, obviously that must have then raised an issue. Prof, coming back to you, do you think Kofi Annan would have been disappointed by the Kenya that we had, especially last year? If he was monitoring?
He would definitely have been very disappointed. I think he thought that they had helped to make peace. They had also, as you know, set up an agenda which went beyond the constitution.
Yes.
And there was, I don't know how, I didn't talk to him much in those days. I was myself in exile, sort of.
Wow.
And so I think he left feeling that they had got a package, not just the constitution, other things.
A package for stability, for long-term stability.
Yes, long-term thing, and you know, and dealing with the past in a creative way, and you know, the 4 points or whatever called, and the Truth, Justice Commission, and so on. All these were extremely important steps. But what have our politicians done with it? Nothing.
Nothing.
So he would have been very disappointed, I think, if he had come back and seen, because I think the constitution that they promoted was extremely suitable for us, had a lot of support from the people themselves. You know, we, Katiba Institute, went round, not Katiba Institute, but the commission, and had dialogue with the people again and again and again. And I think most people felt that the constitution was a very good reflection of Kenya's aspirations. And he thought that too. That's why he pushed that. But who respects the constitution today?
That's a question.
Very, very
That's
little.
a question. Irungu, some of the issues that Kenyans were meant to deal with under Agenda 4, land reforms, deal with historical injustices, deal with corruption, address inequality, regional imbalances, national unity, cohesion. Sounds like what the Building Bridges Initiative are trying to work on in 2018 with the recommendations from 2008.
Right.
Get your thoughts.
Just maybe come back to your earlier question. In many ways, I don't see Kofi Annan as an emotional man. I mean, that's the one thing that I used to find quite fascinating. I mean, almost Zen-like, very peaceful, very calm.
So the pressure never got to him like it would with
you know, when it got to him, he went out and took a walk. Okay. You know, which shocked everybody. You know,
remember the walk?
Yeah, the famous walk. You know, and he was just centering himself again. So really, a person who had control over his emotions, and that's what made him a great negotiator. I think in many ways that he continued to bring it back to source and say, well, what's needed right now? My anger is not necessary. My disappointment is not necessary. What do the negotiators need to do at a moment like this? So that was the first thing. I think looking back, he would be very, you know, he would probably wonder why we missed the opportunities, the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission report. It's still sitting in Parliament. And the other thing probably would be that he would be still puzzled by the lack of or rather the antipathy to him, you know, the hostility to him to this day, because in many ways we would not have a Kenya right now if it had not been for those negotiations and the interest of all of us to find a common ground to move forward. It was good to see the president and the deputy president also give their eulogies yesterday. I was looking very keenly to see whether
that would happen,
whether they would have some greatness and some generosity of spirit, despite having gone to the Hague.
That's right.
As a result of the famous envelope. And that, I think, also is a good thing for me, which was that he was not just interested in moving on. So if you look at the Agenda 4 items, one of the most important things was restitution. One of the most important things was dealing with the impunity and the human rights violations that had happened. And therefore it was inconceivable that you could move forward without some form of justice to be brought for the hundreds of thousands of people who suffered. And I think he was vindicated, because if you look at it, the national courts have not produced justice for the victims of the post-election violence.
That's correct.
The only process that had a level of judicial rigor was the ICC.
Okay. Prof, coming back to you, a lot has been said about Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General, the mediator, but the man himself. Give us insights. What was he like away from the cameras?
Well, I'm not sure I knew him well enough to say that. Most of our contact was really related to some business of the other. Okay. But I found him, I was with him on a committee set up by the Aga Khan and the Canadian government, and we used to meet in Ottawa 2-3 times a year. And I always found him, as I think we've been saying, not pushing himself, but full of ideas, and I thought he was being very diplomatic. He was the most senior person in that group, but he listened.
He was willing to listen.
Others, and I think he was very much committed to peace. I don't know whether it's appreciated enough. I mentioned Middle East, where he put a lot of effort. Even after he ceased to be Secretary General, he wanted peace. And I think this was partly recognition of his passion for peace, that he got the Nobel Prize for Peace.
That's right, in 2011.
And so that is not given just like that. And so I think his credentials were beyond. Of course, most people have limits to what they can do. But as I mentioned earlier, even after being Secretary General, he continued to be very concerned with peace and fairness, and hence his institute, which has done good job.
Which has been doing quite well. Irungu, anything you can tell us
beyond
beyond what we know?
So my daughter Brittany, in her 20s, heard that I was going to meet Kofi Annan during the African Green Revolution Forum a couple of years ago. So she said to me, please, make sure you get a signature from him, like an autograph.
Yes.
So I ended up in the room. It was a very short briefing, 20, 30 minutes. He took briefings very well. So then you had to be quite prepped, because he would ask a number of questions. And at the end of it, without talking to his chief of staff, I said, my daughter has told me that I can't leave you without getting an autograph. So do you mind doing an autograph? So I took out the program for the African Green Revolution Forum. And I said,
he signed on it.
I said, yeah, could you just sign here, dear Brittany, lots of love, Kofi, or something like that. And didn't tell him how to spell her name. And I'm telling this in a bit of detail. So he wrote, but misspelt it. So 1 T, not 2 T's.
Oh, gosh.
And my daughter has a thing about her name, like me, the name being spelled properly. So I looked at it and I thought, oh, gosh. Okay, do I ask him to do it again or not? So I said, excuse me, sir, I have to ask you to do it again, and I apologize, it's 2 T's. So I removed one program, put another program in front of me, and he signed again. And as I was leaving, the chief of staff was escorting me out, and he said to me, Irungu, I can't believe you asked the former Secretary General of the UN to autograph a document.
Not just once.
Without approval from the chief of staff. And then secondly, that you asked him to do it twice. But that was Kofi Annan. He was generous, he was humble, it didn't occur to him what was happening. But I had actually broken a diplomatic protocol, which is that everything you do in the presence of the Secretary General, even an autograph, needs a certain level of...
I hope that story will feature in a book that I'm sure is being talked about right now, being discussed. Prof, how can Kenyans capitalize on this moment? We're talking about Kofi Annan. He's made us remember Agenda 4. He's made us remember 2007, 2008. How can we capitalize on this moment, as your last comment?
Well, I think the best thing we can do is to follow the agenda which was established by his committee. You have already summarized that. I think we have really never had the proper catharsis after the violence of 2008 and 7. And people's expectations were of fairness, justice, and hence the 4 items. I think the best thing we can do to thank him, to commemorate his work for us, is to take up this seriously. And now that there is a campaign on the part of some politicians, including senior politicians, to look at what has gone wrong. And I think we get very good guidance. I don't know how many people have read their ultimate report after they finish their work, which has these chapters dealing with each of the problems, what could be done. And I would suggest that our politicians read that book. It's a very good book, very full of guidance for us. I think the best thing we can do for him and for ourselves is to pick up that agenda, have it done not by politicians, but by people who are committed to justice and fairness.
And reconciliation.
And the role of civil society must be acknowledged.
Thank you so much, Prof. Irungu, for you.
So I think there are 2 things. At the global level, we will remember him as a champion of multilateralism. Really, that nations should not pursue their individual interests, but really have a common understanding of how the world goes. And particularly in this world where we have very few leaders across the spectrum that are thinking about the globe as a whole, whether it be on environment, or whether it be on global peace issues, or whether it be on inequalities. We miss Kofi Annan at this moment, and I would hope that his memory really generates creates another generation of young leaders that are thinking along these lines. I think at the national level, I'm still wondering why we don't have a Kofi Annan highway, or a Kofi Annan road, or a Kofi Annan playground, or a Kofi Annan park, or something like that, a public space that says thank you to this man who at a critical moment in our history came through for us. And if it can't be done at the national level yet, can the county governors who are watching this suggest a couple of streets across the 47 counties, where as we drive, as we walk across, we can remember this great son of Africa.
That's right. Irungu, I think that's a perfect place to leave this. Irungu Houghton, Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya, thank you so much. Prof, it's a real pleasure hosting you this morning. He's a constitutional lawyer, a man who needs almost no introduction, also the former chair of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission. Thank you for helping us to remember Kofi Annan this morning, and for finding time to be here with us on